First of all, everybody's idea of country property is different. Some people are on the wide open plains. Other people have different ideas of what country property is going to look like for them, and that may change through the search process. One of the things that you want to keep in mind is why do you want to move? What's your purpose? What's your reason for moving? And kind of build your wish list around those things. But there's some things that we'll talk about that are just kind of crucial components to any list that would be built, and those are what we're going to be talking about. Of course, in the day we live in, there's lots of reasons for moving to a more rural area. There's political unrest. There's supply chain issues where you want to be able to supply your own edibles and food. Lots of things that happen in urban areas at a high frequency that don't happen as much in a rural environment, and just the peace and solitude that can be found there. Some people don't like as much solitude, but solitude can differ in gradations. I know I grew up in a town. I felt like I was a country kid. My dad was a dairyman, but we lived in town. And when we moved to, actually we were looking for country property as kids, and my mom, we always wanted to move to the country. But my dad was just kind of the man with the brakes on all the time for it. And if he just told us why he had the brakes on, I think we would have had a better understanding and been more observant in our search process when we were kids. This is in the Midwest. But his main concern was living in a fruit country. He didn't want us being exposed to the sprays and the agricultural residues that would be commonly found in the areas where we lived. And so that was one thing that he had a concern for. But we didn't know that until years later after we were adults, that was his primary concern. But that looks different for everybody. And I know that I had some anxiety when we first moved to the country. Interestingly enough, looking back on those anxieties, they're anxieties I would probably have now moving into the city. They're kind of flip-flopped. So they didn't come to fruition, and I don't know that they would necessarily, but higher frequency due to the population in an urban area for sure. So this is a statement that was written in 1904. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country where they can raise their own provisions. For in the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. We should now begin to heed these instructions. 1904. Over and over again, get out of the cities into rural districts where it's not crowded, you're free from interference from enemies, and not crowding closely together. So some key points here: families away from the city. Raising a family away from the city is much better. There's just the creativity and the exposure to pure air and just the natural resources that God has provided, and the lessons of nature are so huge in the country as compared to the city. There's something actually that's been coined as nature deficit disorder, and that's a detachment from the natural world that urban people suffer from, essentially. And actually, deer are safer in towns than they are out here because there's no one out. There's just the houses and the roses to go through, and there's no one outside. They're all inside pushing buttons or whatever, staying cool and staying safe, right? As opposed to having to watch out for more predators. But buying and selling, you want to be able to be self-sustainable. Have nice examples of gardens here that help to make that possible. So thinking sustainably prepared, being able to be as much as possible independent from the systems of this world. When we think about grid down, we think of power being down, but there's lots of other things to your grid besides power. There's your food grid, there's your supply grid, there's your education grid. There's all kinds of things that can be thought about in that realm of sustainable preparedness. So thinking long-term, short-term, but also being prepared to aid others, especially other brothers and sisters in Christ, or those seeking to get out of economic and social strife that are found in urban areas typically. Oops. Let's see. So some reasons to be independently sustainable. So we talked about civil unrest in urban centers, scarcity of provisions in grid down situations. That can be transportation. And there could be lots of different reasons for that. Rolling blackouts, we see that in like California and even South Africa and other nations. That could come to other places near you soon. Economic sanction, that could be individual or collectively, depending on what type of a situation we're in. So those if you have your own support network and supply network already in place, then that isn't going to have as much of an impact on you personally. So a couple books that I found very helpful in our search for property and just being prepared as we've continued to work with what we do have. Sustainable Preparedness by the Meisner family. Just a kind of a great checklist of things to consider. Jerry Franklin wrote a book called You Can Survive, which is a very excellent book that covers both the spiritual aspect of things as well as the physical aspect. Another book that I didn't throw on here is Strategic Relocation, a book by Joel Skousen, I believe is his name. But it looks at other factors for consideration for where you would relocate to, based on whatever scenarios there are.
Who was that by?
Joel Skousen, I think it's Skouzen or A-N?
Ian.
E-N.
It's a really, really good book.
So the first step is to prepare your heart, because wherever you go, there you are, right? And if you go a place somewhere and you're not spiritually prepared to be there, you're just going to be right there with everything you brought with you. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust. From Psalm 91. So being spiritually prepared is really the place to start. And you may want to get away from things, but if your heart isn't right and you get away, again, there you are. So it's something to definitely take into consideration. A prudent man foreseeth evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. So if we can see ahead a little bit and see some things that are coming, we read scripture, we read other prophetic words that tell us what's coming, and just see the signs around us of historical repetitions of life, you can see that ahead of time and bring your family out of harm's way. And there's many different ways of doing that as people choose to go into a more rural area. You do want to be open to God's leading, in my opinion. In 1905 it was written that Christ, we're reminded that He was raised in a rural environment. He had honest, respectable work as a carpenter. He had daily conflict with difficulty, and that's an important thing to train up yourself on discipline in a rural environment is a great place to do that, and that the natural world was a great minister to Christ. In 1903, it said, get out of the cities as soon as possible, and that was 1903. That was over 100 years ago, 120 years ago. Purchased a little piece of property, and it's also stated that you'll be like kings and queens if you have a piece of property you can grow your own provisions on. So kind of a key thing. Now you can buy property, that's expensive, but what if you buy in the wrong place and you wish you hadn't? So I understand right now in northern Idaho there's a lot of COVID buyers, people that came in to get away from something and they realized they didn't like winter and they're trying to go somewhere else. So it may be better to rent first. Come into an area and rent, kind of get to lay the land. Is this really what I really want to be? Then you're not out a whole lot before you find where you want to settle. And sometimes you can work as a caretaker for someone else who has property there. There are people who have properties that live somewhere else. So there are other ways to do it. You could come vacation there, Airbnb or VRBO, and just spend some time in an area and see if it's where you want to be. I was told that this area, a good time to look for property if you want to be able to grow things is in March. So you can see when the snow melts in different places, because there's microclimates that you need to take into consideration for growing things. There's ways to overcome that, like the Wallapini and greenhouses and hoop houses and things like that. But if the less there is to overcome, the better in whatever situation you have. We'll talk about the basics of what you're looking for in a rural property: shelter, water, food, and heat. And those are going to look different depending on the property you're looking at. But those are the basic elements that you're going to need: some kind of shelter, some kind of water, reliable water source. Ability to raise your own food, whether it's livestock or plants, and then a reliable heat source. We'll start with shelter. Most efficient is getting an existing dwelling. Building can be a real challenge for individuals who are moving. Moving is one thing, building is another. That's a stressful thing on everybody's life in a building situation. But existing dwellings can be everything from something that's finished to something that's unfinished. I've found unfinished log homes. People got tired of the project, had to move on. Even stick-framed houses that are not finished. People got tired of the project or ran out of money. You can pick it up and use that as a springboard into something for you. So it takes time to find that. You have to look, and it may not be the first thing you find. I mean, in our search for country property, it was a couple-year process to find it. So don't be discouraged as you're looking for something. Just stay the course and continue pursuing it. Also, if you just go with raw land, you need a temporary structure of some kind in between. I mean, these guys have a tiny house. They're intending to build some additional structures here, but you can go yurts. You can do modular yurts to expand your area. They can do very large yurts. Of course, yurts came from the steppes of Asia, so they definitely can work in cold weather. You can do wall tents. People have lived in wall tents temporarily on property. Tiny houses. So mobile tiny houses as well as semi-permanent tiny houses like we have here. This is kind of the example here, park model RVs. So there's different ways to get on the land. One thing that has been discussed is purchasing land. If you can purchase land outright versus financing, that's easier, because when you're financing, they always want water, or there's some other criteria that often come with financing. So a well, if there's a pre-existing well, that makes things easier for financing, or other water sources. Our property, there was an adjacent property that we looked at to pick up along with it, and we talked to the bank about financing, and it had previously been a part of our property, but it had been separated through a bank sale, but there was a water line that ran over there to a hydrant. So we could honestly say that there was water on the property and we could obtain financing. But once it was sold, we cut that water line, and it was someone else ended up building there later, so it changed some of the configurations of where we moved into originally, but that water source being available would have enabled financing. So that's something to kind of consider as you're looking for property. Teepees, so there's some pretty posh teepees, so just some different temporary structures that one could use as you're waiting to either build the finances or build your more permanent structure. So water sources, a well is very important, an independent water source. If you're in a place with some kind of municipal water, I would shy away from places that have like a group well or a community water system, because there's still maintenance and things like that that is above and beyond what an individual well has. There are well pumps that occasionally go out and other systems with that, so just need to be prepared that you are the water company as opposed to relying on someone else for that. And with that water source, if you have a well, you want to have a way to get the water out of that well if you don't have normal power to get it out. So a hand pump, or, you know, a beautiful thing, I don't have it here, it's in the next picture, is an artesian well. There are artesian well properties that come up periodically. Wonderful. I've heard that there are wells in this area that can put forth about 200 gallons a minute. That's a lot of water. But, you know, down to lower levels of water, 6 gallons is pretty decent. But lower than that, may end up needing to use cisterns to make up any volume of water that would be used at any one time. So depending on what your needs are, these folks here, I just understand that they personally use only 5 gallons of water a day for the two of them. They've learned to conserve water because they're actually hauling water here from their well. It's not pumped up here yet. So most of the water they have here is water catchment at this point. So you can water from streams and lakes. Those are interesting sources, and even water from rain catchment systems is interesting, because technically, if it's not from the ground, if it's from the air on the surface of waters of the state, so there are some rules around those. But have some family friends who have utilized water catchment systems, and it does require some filtration, but it's a way to get enough water without wells. In our area, there's actually a well drilling moratorium, which the tribes had influence on to save the salmon, and it cut off all development essentially because the wells were not allowed to be drilled. And they were able to work with the county. They were lenient with this and worked with some engineers and were able to design a rainwater catchment system. and were able to maintain their water that way. So since they've been there, they've expanded that, because after being there and knowing how much water they're using, going through some droughts, they've added some additional tanks to up that water supply during the summer or the winter months. So we're on the west side, so there's more rain there. I don't know what the annual rainfall is here, if you could rely on water catchment for your water supply on this side of the state, but you would want to have a metal roof if you're doing water rain catchment, as opposed to composite or shingle or shake. You want to have a metal rain system. So cisterns can work, or above ground water tanks. There's different ways of accomplishing that. So water is really important. In fact, some would say that that's the #1 thing that you need to look for as a criteria on your property. A regular, continuous water supply. So that can come in the form of springs. Springs are very good. I have a friend in Tennessee who they have a spring on their property. That's their water source. And looking at the spring, it runs about like that. But you know, God provides. He did some calculations, and he found out that just that constant trickle 24/7 gave them more than enough water than they could ever use if they were to catch it all and not let it just go away. So it was abundant supply for them. And not all springs are the same. Some springs can be developed. I know that they have some springs that they've attempted to develop here. But artesian wells are a beautiful thing too, especially if they have some pressure behind them. So the next thing is food and garden space, orchard space. Ideally, you would already have an orchard in place. Now, sometimes you can find property that is an old property, maybe doesn't have a house anymore. There may be a well and a septic there, but the house isn't there. There's some old apple trees or pear trees or whatever. That's a beautiful thing. Establishing fruit trees is nice to have, or other orchards. But then finding a place that has arable, tillable land. So these guys here have been using a lot of compost. But the soil here is glacial till, and you all know what that is. It's just the rolling cobble left behind by the glaciers moving through the area. Not a lot of topsoil humus, so they use a lot of composting to build that up. And most anywhere you would want to do that to continue to enrich your soil. But if you can start as far ahead on that as you can, the better. Just one less thing to focus on. So here's a good cutaway of a glacial till bank. You know, very thin layer of topsoil. Yeah, there's a lot of grass growing on there, but their roots are more shallow, and the topsoil layers can be pretty thin. So doing a water or a soil test is a good idea before you move on the property, because just looking at it, there's lots of vegetation here, but it may not support a garden very well. And then there's different ways to do raised beds. This is kind of an urban idea, but you can still add that quality to it. So step 4, there's a number of other points to consider. One of those is where are you going to move and what are you going to do for work? Unless you can independently, wealthily retire, you need to know how you're going to provide an income for yourself. So current work, maybe you can still do that, do a telecommute or online. Previous work sources that you've done, become self-employed, or some niche types of businesses or healthcare, just some ideas. But think about that. That's something that the Meisners talked about is a thing that they hadn't considered as highly as they probably should have when they moved out. Just how you're going to maintain your current income status, if that's what you're basing everything on. Other things to consider, you want to have southern exposure. So interestingly, you know, a south-facing slope is going to get more sun. That's going to be great for growing things. A north side, you're going to have winter longer. You're going to have more vegetation, but you're going to have more shade. Here, that might be nice to have that option to have shade because it gets very hot here in the summertime. But you also want to have exposure for solar collection. If you're on the north side and the sun never really reaches where you're sitting, solar isn't a very viable option for power generation. So thinking about the aspect of the land and the direction that you're pointing is important for not only gardening success, but the potential for using solar power. So this is just an example of a house using passive heating, a nice south-facing slope. So they're doing water collection, water heating through solar power, as well as power generation. Lots of different ways to use that. And then, you know, just thinking about the different ways and things to keep in mind when trying to grow things. Knowing, too, that the aspect of your land, flat land and elevation, the higher you go, it changes your growth zone, your plant growth zone. But if you have a tilt to your land that's tilting south, that actually decreases your growing zone. So it makes it so it's a lower growing zone. So I think a higher number is a colder climate. So it can actually change the climatic aspect of your growing. So depending on the pitch, you may end up having to do some terracing or things like that. But that's something to consider with your land that you're looking at. So just the veggie list here. Kind of cruising through a little bit here because we got a little bit of a late start. But thinking about the shade, you know, you have a nice forest, but where you're going to, positioning of where you can till and actually do your garden is an important thing to consider. Also, where in the world are you going to be? So we're in the United States, thinking about places that have elbow room with national forests and wilderness areas around them. So definitely up in the west here, there's more of that opportunity. There is some of that in the east, in the southeast and central east, north Midwest, but not more so out this direction. And just kind of being aware of where those places are. This is Washington State. You know, we're over here right now, but there's the North Cascades, and these are the wilderness areas. There are many properties, not many, but some properties you can find that have national forest on 2 or 3 sides, and you know you're not going to have neighbors that are going to be butting right up next to you there. The one thing that you may keep in mind, though, with those is that you may not have that land there all the time in the same fashion as you moved in, because they can sell logging rights, right? So it may become logged if it's not already logged. So this is Northern Cal, Southern Oregon, just looking at a national forest and then the proximity of properties that would be available. Sometimes there's inholdings, so there are possibility of finding inholdings. Those can be challenging. Watching for easements and things like that. We were looking at a 40-acre inholding in a timber tract. It was pretty enticing, but it would have been pretty difficult to get into, and the road would have need some significant rehabbing in order to make it accessible. So how much land do you need? Well, depends on where it's situated. And it depends on where the neighbors are. I always like to look at the aerial views and see where the neighbors are. And you don't buy a house sight unseen, of course. People do that, but you should go and visit the neighborhood, visit your neighbors, get acquainted with the area. But 1 to 2 acres, you can do a lot on 1 to 2 acres if it's situated appropriately. And more land, is good. We're on 5 acres, but they have 75 or so here. And other places have more or less, but you do what God has led you to do. So utilities, power, water, sewer. What do you do with your garbage? So we go to a landfill. We just carry our garbage to a transfer site. We recycle about half of it in a landfill, transfer site the other. But you don't necessarily have garbage collection wherever you are. Sewer. So you don't have sewer. You have a septic system. These guys don't have a septic system at this point because they compost directly. They compost their fecal matter and use it for their garden after a year. But you want to not have an engineered system that's above ground. Some places don't perk well. So you need to do perk tests. The water flows through too fast. An engineered system requires power. And if power is a premium, you want to have a gravity-fed system. So just think about that. Water and how is your power source going to be maintained. So rainwater, well, how close is the schools, groceries, work, those types of things are important things to consider. The seasons, so that's going to be dependent upon your elevation and your latitude and the pitch of your land. So those are all things that play into how those seasons affect you. Notice your high and low temperatures, your plant hardiness zone. So some of that can be overcome with hoop houses like the Wallapini or a greenhouse, but you don't want to have to necessarily rely on those types of additional structures immediately. Are you part of a 911 dispatch zone? Can EMS come to you if you need it? That can actually affect insurance. I don't know that it affects loans so much, but it could affect insurance, property insurance, if you're not in a fire zone. So just being aware of that. The timber and the terrain and your neighbor proximity. Do you have to cross someone else's property to get to your own property? Do you have a watchman essentially at your driveway door? Do people just watch you coming and going all the time? Is that something you want? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So keep in mind that the only place that's perfect is heaven. God will guide you as you lean on Him. And what's good for you might not be good for someone else. And you might move again. So keep that in mind. You know, you invest all your resources into one place, and there may become a reason that you may need to relocate again. And that's why it might be a good idea to rent somewhere first before you move on. So commit thy works to the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established, is a great proverb to keep in mind. And then how do we go about looking for your country property? Well, one thing that kind of initiated our search was reading a little book called Country Living. There was, my wife and I had a similar dream for a log home. Didn't realize that before we got married, but happily discovered that after we got married. But we had our children. We lived in a small community and decided we didn't want to live on a postage stamp and raise our girls in town, essentially. And so with the counsel and the teaching from Country Living, we felt like that's what we needed to do. And so we embarked on that project. So first of all, we thought we'd buy property and build a log home. So started looking around for property, raw land, and we're going to build a log home on it. And then that wasn't really coming to fruition. The second plan was to just stay where we were and buy a rental property as an income property. And then once that became established, we'd be able to maybe move then. And plan C was to buy a pre-existing property. So we kind of moved through all these phases of our search. And we realized that property was really expensive and could require phasing your building. So building a shop or another structure that you live in, a barn for a while, and then you build your house just to get yourself on the property. We'd found one property that was just amazing. It was a beautiful view down the valley, 20 acres, had a running creek through it, within a few miles of work and church, south facing, but it had some weird things too. It was very expensive. It would require phasal building. It was a very steep terrain, so it would have required some tough gardening aspects. We could hear interstate traffic, which wasn't appealing to us. So going to the place where you're going to live and being there at different times of day and different times of the year, if you can, is helpful. So where we had lived prior to moving out was near a naval air station and a flyway, so the landing zones and the takeoff zones, so it was quite noisy. Is that something you want to live with all the time? Maybe you're going to be hearing sirens at a hospital or shoppers coming in at night to the hospital where I lived in town. That was the way it was. Or where we live now, we actually do hear a racetrack periodically, but it's far enough away that it sounds like a beehive for a little bit, and it's not overwhelmingly bad. But we might have chosen somewhere a little bit differently if that had been more loud. This place had some CCRs in place, or HOAs, covenants that we wanted to kind of stay away from. They had an unusual water access, so it had a well, but it was like across the road and down in the community that was a part of. So it was just kind of some weird stuff that we decided we didn't really want to fiddle with. So we kept looking. We kind of gave up on the property idea. We made an offer on a short sale, and we're just waiting and waiting and waiting, and that wasn't going anywhere. Just as an income property, not to move there, but just to maybe increase just the bottom line. And then we were just cruising through the listings one more time and discovered this place. So it was just one day on the market, and it was on 5 acres. The house was south facing. It already had outbuildings in place. North end was cleared and full sun. It had trees and pasture combined. It was not far from a river, but it was elevated above it. It had it was off the street, so it wasn't right on the street. It was fairly secluded. It was a log home that had been there for 30 plus years, so it had done any settling that it was going to do. And it was made by a craftsman, so we could tell that just right away. It did have some access issues, so there were some things to overcome. But just because there's things to overcome doesn't mean it's a deal killer. Because sometimes that's just a test of your persistence and tenacity. Had been neglected, and actually it had been done, was a bank sale. And if we hadn't spent all that previous time looking for property, we probably would not have been in the position or the thought process to jump and say, yes, this is what we're going to do. We also remodeled our home in the other communities, so we were handy on doing the remodeling. And it had been neglected on the interior, and it had been empty for some years. But we decided to do that. So we made the offer in February, not really knowing what the whole terrain was. We found out later when we actually closed in July that there was some beautiful blueberry bushes right here that were just waiting for us. But so we ended up purchasing it for a quarter of its previous value because it was bank owned. But it was a real blessing, and today it's a lot different than it was when we first moved in. But able to do the solar application because it's a direct view facing south property. But where would you look for properties? So there's a lot of different places. I just have a few here. Movoto is one place. You can just type in your location. Lots of different things come up, homes and properties. Here's a property with a log home on it that is not finished, so that's a property that could be developed. So there's already a shell there. There's raw land. Of course, there's everything in between. So Movoto is one site that one can use. You're probably familiar with Zillow. Zillow has lots of different areas where it covers, and you can get lots of different criteria. You can do your price ranges. So this one was a fairly new listing. Everything from raw land again to just typical houses. So there's just kind of the whole gamut. One thing that you can do with this criteria, which is helpful, and for some people it may be really helpful, is using the keywords and owner financing. Not all property is owner financing, but some will offer owner financing as an incentive for people to purchase the property and just help them out with it. So some keywords are owner financing. OWC is owner will carry or owner may carry. You could even type in off-grid if that's what you wanted. Zero down. There's still some zero down properties. Seller financing could be bank owned or foreclosure. Just use some keywords that you can pull out. And I don't know if Redfin does that keyword kind of component as well, but Redfin is another very popular site for using that. But this is one that was pointed out to me as a way to do that. So this is one just as an example of one that had possible owner financing. So that's another kind of a keyword. And I think I just put in owner financing and it popped up with possible owner financing. So Redfin is another example of very similar to Zillow. They're very, very compatible. But they will both do like a specific area. If you want to be in a particular area within a zone, they'll just look at the properties there. You can take that boundary away and it shows everything outside of it. Some of these you can choose, condos or multifamily dwellings or raw land. So you can do your criteria and it'll sift out all those other things so that you can be more pinpointed in your search. Survival Realty, and there are other ones too. There's realty.com. But this one is particularly looking at nationwide properties that are more in line with someone who's wanting to move away from an urban area. But they have a variety of different categories: rural land, homesteads, cabins, bunkers and bomb shelters, if that's what you're looking for. Solar and off-grid, international, American Redoubt. So that's what they call this. Inland Northwest is the American Redoubt. Commercial and business, rural homes, farm and ranch. So that's on the survivalrealty.com site. Facebook Marketplace. There's actually, you can do real estate on Facebook Marketplace, which is kind of an interesting way to do that, but it's set up very similar to Zillow and Redfin. I mean, you got your properties here. There's probably some raw land available in that scene as well. And there's even Craigslist. So real estate for sale. So this is the Spokane region. So Craigslist, and there may be things there that are for sale by owner. And there's actually FSBO is at fsbobyowner.com. So that's another one that's like Redfin and like Zillow that you can do. But things might show up here that don't show up in the regular listings. And so looking in places like that can be just a different way of looking at the same area and seeing things that you wouldn't come up in the regular listings. Now, something that we mentioned earlier, someone was saying that one type of Zillow or Redfin was more responsive than the other. Well, we actually found an agent that we trusted and wanted to work with. We would do our research here, our front-end research, and then talk to our agent. We didn't go through any of these sites to actually go and look at the land. So this is some land, raw land, and structures on Craigslist. So prayer, patience, and persistence are key. The 3 Ps. We had some access issues. We discovered that we had 10 acres. Well, it was 5 acres, but it had been 10 acres with a T. And the driveway came across the 5 acres that was not with the house. And the bank was not able to gain access through that property. They couldn't get an easement. And because the property owner wasn't willing to sell it or allow access. She was trying to hold us over the barrel and sell us that property too, and we weren't really in a position to do that at that time. But we continued to just kind of look at options with that, and we found that there was actually a northern easement that was already deeded into the property. And so we were able to access that and actually ask for a price reduction, and they gave it to us in order to develop that. So that actually worked out quite well for us. So God provides. So some things to consider: if your property is not right on the road, do you have access, and what's your easement access like? So this is kind of an example of what our property had been like. Just a driveway across. We found a northern easement access that was already there. We ended up doing a boundary survey because there was a bit of a boundary dispute. We had a power pole that was here, and the property owner said that we were going to have to buy the driveway and move the power pole if we didn't, which would have been very expensive, but we were pretty certain it was already on our parcel, so we just paid to have a boundary survey done. It's always good. I mean, fences can move. Good fences make good neighbors, but if your neighbor has put their fence up significantly on your land, you'd like to know that and maybe get that right. So a boundary survey is always a good idea. So ambient noise. Talk to your neighbors, come at different times of day. We actually hear a railroad from where we live. Occasionally hear the whistle, train whistle. It's not constant, but it's occasionally, just depending on the wind. Summer evenings, like I mentioned, we hear racetrack noise. Watch for mining activity nearby. There could be mining activity, or even an undeveloped mine that could be rehabbed and brought back into service. Could be logging activity that is happening or will come into service. So just be aware of that. And if you're bumped up against national forest land, your buffer may disappear. So mineral right overlay. So that's like the county or the state owns the rights to the oil or the gravel mine in the area, or even on your property. Mineral rights can be something to consider too. And then just checking the proximity to your neighbors and what kind of buffer zone do you really want. Terrain, is it flat, varied, or steep? Are you in an elevated place? That's going to change your growing zone. So as you move higher, of course, your hardiness zone changes. South facing versus north facing, we mentioned that. I think Zillow in particular has hazard zones. So they show the floodplains, and you could be along a nice waterway, but is that going to be a potential flood zone? Is it like a 30 or 100-year floodplain? When we were looking at our property, I was very happy to note it on the local community colleges where I was teaching. They had a Lahar zone map for a volcano that's near us, and we were out of the Lahar zone. So we were in a river valley, but it was a spring-fed river, and it wasn't connected with the glaciers at all. And so if the mountain blew, there were lots of ridges between us and no Lahar fields. So that's something to consider. And microclimates. So in our area, the local knowledge is when the snow comes off this particular mountain, then you plant. Don't plant before the snow coming off because you're likely to get a frost. So microclimates are something that living in an area before you actually purchase can be helpful in understanding better. So utilities, is your power there? How far away is power from where you want to live? That can be very expensive, putting in a power line, especially if it's underground. Your water, taste it, have it tested. Your sewer, inspect and verify, have it pumped. Phone, what's your phone like? I mean, are you satellite uplink? Is it, do you have Wi-Fi? Is that necessary? Is it not necessary? Be aware of the proximity to 5G towers and things like that, because some people are very sensitive to the wireless interferences. High tension power lines. My parents were looking at country property, and one of the ones they looked at was you could hear the buzz of the power lines right behind them. So it's like an automatic X. Underground petroleum lines. So in our county there are some refineries, and they have underground petroleum lines that go through the backs of some people's property. And there's railway accesses like that you have to go through sometimes. I've looked at properties that look really nice, and then they've got the big high tension lines in the back end or something. So just things to look at. So most counties have some kind of a search engine like this, where you can put in an address or a parcel number and find out more information about it. And so you go to the county assessor or the county offices, and usually it's a website, but it could be, you may have to go, depending on the county, directly in, but most of them are web-based now. But this gives you the owner's information, the parcel number, the transfer history, so you go back how far in history as you can, various permits and things. You can look at different map views. What are the taxes? How have they changed? So that gives you the current assessments. All those kinds of things are available for you to look at on any given property. You can look at the layout of the map. So the realtor map and the Google map and the assessor's map are all maybe different, right? So you want to look at as close as you can to what the surveyed map actually shows. So this is a particular property in on Redfin here, and it's raw land. Just looking at where it might be, and particularly on Redfin, they actually have the parcel number. So you take your parcel number, you take that to the county site, you pop that in, and then you can get the detailed information about that particular. This is the legal description. There was a quitclaim deed, so it passed on mineral right overlay. It's probably rural reserve, and there's some other other criteria that you can get a lot of information from these county sites. And part of that is, this is the parcel that we're looking at there, P118221. It was a 20-acre parcel, is how it was noted. This is the assessor's map. You can see a creek running through it. You see the road coming in. It's kind of end of the road location. But it's interesting, it's a 20-acre piece, but when you look at it, that 20-acre piece it's 19 plus 1. So that's something you'd want to verify if this one is probably, this is where the house is, or maybe a house was going to be if it's raw land, and this was going to be left in timber, so they could keep a timber class. So sometimes properties in a lower tax bracket if there's timber management resources on it. So this is the tract here, looking at the nearest neighbors in this particular piece. This is Sierra Pacific Timber Company around it. So nice that there's timber around it. So just doing your due diligence and looking at the maps and looking at who owns what around you can be helpful in your search process. Looking at the elevation markers. So this is Geographic Information System, GIS, and they have a lot of information that they can layer and overlay. And this is what this is from, but it actually gives elevation markers. And this particular property looks like it's fairly level, but then this is all you can learn. You can learn this in your armchair, but that doesn't quite. You always have to go on site to get a good look at it if it's something you're interested in. But you can sort a lot out, of course, just from home. So an aerial Google map shows that same piece of property, even though it's surrounded by timber tract, it's been recently logged. So it's no trees. So it'll grow back, but you don't have to worry about it being cut because it's already been cut. So what you get, what you see is what you get. So that's kind of nice, and it'll come back better over the course of your occupancy. So it just tells you who owns it, and just a verification that this is part of the 20. Just can create questions that you might have. The nearest neighbors, again, this is where the real estate map said that it was. This is where the county map said it was. So there's disparity. Sometimes you'll just get a non-address in the address area, and you have to look at it and see if you can figure it out, and then get it on Google Maps, and kind of overlay those two things until you actually find where the property is, because they don't actually give you a physical address. So you have to be a detective in the whole due diligence process. So remember to do your due diligence. Proverbs 3:3-9 says, "Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck. Write them upon the table of thine heart. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not on thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord, and depart from evil. It shall be health to thy navel, and marrow to thy bones. Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of thine increase." So just some things to think about, and trust God and do your due diligence.
To be aware of new videos like this one, be sure to subscribe to the Preparing for the Time of Trouble channel. For more free videos and downloadable audio podcasts, as well as handouts, go to www.preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com. Topic categories include recordings of live seminar presentations, country living, sustainable gardening, homestead remedies, how to be self-sufficient when the grid goes down, wild edible and medicinal plants, hydrotherapy, and end-time Bible prophecies. To take advantage of these free resources, go to preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com.